Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Close your eyes for a moment and try to picture a building, not your house, not a cathedral, not even a city. I mean something so far beyond all of that, something so vast and so old and so dense with history that the comparison to anything you have actually stood inside feels almost rude. I mean something that, when you look at it from low orbit above the planet it sits on, you can trace the curve of the world beneath its shadow. Something that has been growing, layer upon layer, for nearly 30,000 years. Something that is home to billions of people who were born inside its walls and will die inside its walls without ever once stepping outside to breathe air that does not first pass through recycling systems the age of small civilizations. Something that has its own weather, its own ecosystems, well, its own tribes and dialects and mythologies that exist nowhere else in the galaxy and have developed in isolation from the rest of humanity, sealed inside a structure so enormous that the word inside barely applies anymore. Now open your eyes, because I want to tell you about the Imperial Palace on Terra. Welcome to Q on 40K. Settle in somewhere comfortable. Let your breathing slow and your mind go quiet, and let me walk you through the most extraordinary structure the human race has ever built, and the most haunting. Part 1. The scale of the impossible. The first thing you need to understand, before anything else, before we talk about who lives here, or what happens in the deeper corridors, or what the air smells like closest to the Golden Throne, that is just how completely impossible the Imperial Palace is to hold in your mind all at once. This is not an architectural description problem. This is a cognitive one. The human brain evolved to process scales of roughly a few hundred meters to a few kilometers as meaningful spaces, and the Imperial Palace exceeds that scale by multiple orders of magnitude in every direction simultaneously. Stand anywhere on the surface of Terra in the 41st millennium and look toward what was once called the Himalayan mountain range, now known as the Himalaysians, and you will see the palace rising above the mountains, not rising to match the mountains, not rising alongside them, rising above them. A structure so tall that in certain places it breaks through the atmosphere and extends into the void of low orbit. And a structure so wide that cartographers gave up trying to measure it from a single vantage point because the curvature of the planet means you simply cannot see both edges at the same time. You would need to orbit the world to get an accurate sense of the whole, and even then, what you would be seeing would be the surface of a thing whose true extent is mostly downward, burrowing hundreds of miles into Terra's bedrock in the other direction. The outer walls alone, just the walls, not the buildings or towers or administrative complexes or residential hives or sacred spaces beyond them, reach heights of 1,500 meters in certain sections. Think about that number for a moment. 1,500 meters. The tallest structures on most worlds in the Imperium don't come close to that. A single battlement wall of the Imperial Palace is taller than the majority of skyscrapers ever built in the history of the civilization that eventually became the Imperium. And those walls are up to 1,000 meters wide at their thickest points. They are not walls, they are cities that happen to be arranged in a defensive perimeter. Inside those wall sections are power generators capable of running most mid-sized hive cities, ammunition processing facilities, aircraft hangars, barracks for hundreds of thousands of soldiers, void shield generators, whose output would be the envy of most planetary defense networks. Defense towers that look like gun citadels rise every 100 meters along the wall's length. The fortifications are not decoration or ceremony, they are function, blunt and vast and built to last longer than the civilizations they were designed to protect against. From orbit, from the perspective of a ship coming in through the Sol system's outer defenses, past the centuries of Imperial Navy fortifications, down through Terra's increasingly thin and polluted atmosphere, the palace appears as something geological, a series of interconnected pyramidal and monolithic structures, each one multiple kilometers high, their surfaces broken by landing pads and studded with weapons emplacements, the whole complex resting on the spine of the Himalayas, like a crown of stone and metal and ceramite that has simply grown there over millennia because it had nowhere else to go. What the mountains that once included what humans called the roof of the world now serve as the foundation of the most important building in the galaxy. The Imperial Palace is approximately the size of a large country. Some sources suggest it covers a significant portion of the Asian continent. Its macro-habs and spaceports break through the atmosphere and rise into the void. Its sublevels dig hundreds of miles down into Terra's holy bedrock. Its vaults, corridors, fortifications, plazas and chambers are so numerous that no single record has ever successfully catalogued them all. And the law explicitly tells us this. It is not that the records have been lost or destroyed. It is that the task of cataloguing was so large that it was never completed. And by the time any one section was being finished, other sections had already changed. Which is the building outpaces its own documentation. And it is full, completely, densely, bewilderingly full of people. Not in the way a theatre is full on opening night, or even the way a city is full on a busy day. The Imperial Palace has a higher density of population per square kilometre than most hive cities, which are among the most densely inhabited structures in the Imperium. Billions of people, not millions, not tens of millions, billions, work and live and sleep and eat and pray and queue and die within this structure every single day. The sheer metabolic output of that many human beings, their heat and breath and movement and sound contributes to the palace's internal climate in ways that require constant management by systems that are themselves centuries old. From the rails of high balconies in the administrative sections, you can look down into artificial ravines that are 500 stories deep, and those ravines are not empty. They are filled with the warm amber light of 1 million lumen globes, and with the constant drift of people moving along corridors and lifts and transit systems at every visible level, an endless flowing motion that looks, from high enough up, something like blood moving through the veins of an enormous living thing. Some of the great domed sections of the palace complex, particularly the space known as the hegemon, are so vast that they contain their own miniature weather systems. This is not a metaphor. Microclimate clouds form and drift under painted, vaulted ceilings, so distant above that they are often invisible in the artificial haze. When it rains inside the hegemon, actual rain falling from actual clouds, or inside a building, the population of the space considers it a portent of good fortune. They have a mythology around indoor rain. Think about that for as long as you need to. A place so large that weather happens inside it, and people have developed traditions and beliefs around that weather, because the weather is a fact of their world, and their world is an interior space. This is what the Emperor of Mankind built, and this is what 10,000 years of bureaucracy, faith, decay, rebuilding, conflict, and the slow, grinding entropy of operating the largest institution in the history of a species have produced. A structure that is simultaneously the most magnificent thing humanity has ever created, and one of the most oppressive environments in the galaxy to actually live in. And a place where demigod warriors in golden armor walk corridors that also contain people dying of starvation while waiting in a queue for a menial's job. A place where the most sacred object in existence and the most mundane administrative task exist within the same walls. This is the Imperial Palace, and we are going to spend some time inside it. Part 2. How it came to be. The palace was not built in a single generation or even a single millennium. Its history is layered in the way that archaeological sites are layered, each era of its construction sitting atop the previous one, sometimes harmoniously and sometimes in violent contrast. Construction began in the closing years of the Unification Wars, somewhere in what we would consider the late 30th millennium, though pinning down exact dates in 40K lore is always an exercise in approximation. The context matters enormously. The planet Terra, which we know today as Earth, had spent roughly 2,500 years in a state of near-continuous war. The Age of Strife had collapsed the interstellar civilization of humanity's golden age, and the survivors on Terra had fallen into the hands of techno-barbarian warlords, mutant armies, and brutal tyrants, whose names have since been erased or forgotten. The soil was being poisoned, the atmosphere was darkening, the oceans were shrinking. The species that had once looked at the stars with genuine ambition was now primarily occupied with surviving Tuesday. As into this world came a being who had been alive since long before the Age of Strife began. A man, or something that looked like a man, and carried a man's history, and spoke with a man's voice, who had been living in secret across the centuries, watching humanity's long, slow catastrophe, and waiting for the moment when he could act. The Emperor, whose true name has been lost to time, if he ever had one, that was truly his in the way that ordinary humans have names, raised an army and began the unification of Terra. Campaign by campaign, city by city, warlord by warlord, he brought the broken world under a single authority. It took time, it cost lives, and when it was done, he made a decision about what to build on the foundations he had cleared. The location chosen for the palace was the Himalayan range, the highest ground on the planet, and a spine of ancient stone that had survived everything the Age of Strife could throw at it. This choice was not merely practical, though it was that. High ground is defensible, ancient bedrock is stable, but there is also a symbolic logic to building the greatest human monument on the highest natural point on the world that gave birth to the species. It is a statement of permanence, of ambition, of the belief that whatever comes next, this thing will still be standing when it arrives. The design work was done by the finest craftspeople and architects of the many Masonic guilds of Terra, organizations that had maintained their traditions of skill and precision through even the darkest years of the Age of Strife. The early management of the construction was left to the seneschals of the Departamento Regia Interior, and the defensive aspects were overseen by the Primarch Rogel Dawn, who would eventually make his own dramatic mark on the palace's form. Though that came later, construction of the palace took at minimum 200 years, continuing into the end of the Great Crusade era, which gives you a sense of the scale of the undertaking. In its early days, the palace was a place of genuine wonder, not just as a fortress or an administrative center, but as an expression of what humanity was capable of when it turned its ambition toward creation rather than destruction. The Emperor contributed personally to its aesthetic. The lore describes at least one painting he created, a masterwork of such enormous scale that it barely fit in the room that housed it, and which apparently contained clues to the Emperor's long-term plans if you knew how to read it. Would he had private residences within the inner palace that reflected the breadth of his interests and the depth of his capabilities. The Hall of Leng, where he would go to think at the deepest level, existed in a peculiar relationship with time itself, a space built on what the lore describes as a pulled thread in the fabric of space-time, a scar on the skin of reality that the Emperor had found and built upon, and expanded with purposes that have never been fully explained. The inner gardens were kept alive with genuine flora and fauna from ancient Terra's past, preserved against the progressive death of the planet's natural environment outside the palace walls. A breathing, growing sanctuary in the midst of all that stone and metal and ceramite. The Emperor, whatever else he was, kept living things close to him in those days. As there is something in that detail that feels important to hold on to, given what came later. The Great Observatory was a dome 2,000 meters tall and 4 kilometers wide, built from solid marble. The approach to it required climbing 300-meter wide steps, and the interior was etched with the portraits of astronomers from humanity's past. Galileo, Tycho Brahe, Hypatia, Caroline Herschel, names that appear in the lore explicitly as individuals the Emperor had reason to honor. At the center hung the obsidian speculum, an arcane device built for observing galaxies so distant that no human starship would ever reach them. It was damaged beyond repair during the Siege of Terra. It has never been rebuilt. The Hall of Victories functioned as a private museum. The Emperor collected artifacts of human achievement in the deepest sense. Not trophies of conquest, but evidence of the species' capacity for invention. Shards of what the lore says was the first clay pot made in antiquity, the actual Mars rover, recovered from wherever 10,000 years had left it, a circuit board from humanity's first warp drive, the Mendelian eukaryotic genesis formula in a sealed tube, the scientific breakthrough that enabled the first human clone, the discovery that changed what it meant to be alive and to make life. These objects sat in their cases and spoke of what the species had already accomplished. The Emperor, who had been there for much of it, apparently wanted those records kept where he could see them. And then, in the 31st millennium, came the Horus heresy. Visions when the scale of Horus's betrayal became clear, when it became apparent that the War Master of the Great Crusade, the Emperor's chosen son, was leading half the Space Marine legions in open rebellion against terror itself. The Emperor gave Rogel Dawn the authority to do whatever was necessary to defend the palace. Dawn was the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, the finest siege engineer and fortress builder in human history, a man who approached defensive architecture the way a surgeon approaches an operation, with absolute precision, complete willingness to do what is necessary, and no sentimentality whatsoever. Dawn assessed the palace as a military problem and solved it. The Annapurna Gate, whose craftsmanship had taken the master sculptor Menzo of Traver 30 years to complete, a gate so beautiful that millions of pilgrims would later travel across the Imperium just to stand before it, was dismantled, not neglected or boarded up, dismantled, removed from existence because Dawn's calculations identified it as a defensive liability. The story suggests he wept at some of it, but he did not hesitate, not once. The Siege of Terror itself lasted 55 days. The fighting was the most concentrated and devastating in human history. Traitor Astartes, demonic entities, engines of war and warp-born horror pressing against the palace walls while enscombed, the defenders held and bled and died in corridors that had been designed for processions and scholarship and contemplation. And the great architectural spaces cracked under bombardment. The beautiful things burned, and when it ended, when the Emperor lay broken and Horus lay dead, and the traitor forces were scattered, what remained of the palace was a fortress with a corpse at its heart. The 10,000 years that followed have been, in architectural terms, a process of forgetting and overgrowth. The machinery required to keep the Emperor alive expanded steadily, consuming more and more of the inner sanctum. The administrative apparatus required to manage a recovering empire of 1 million worlds moved into every available space. Millions became billions, became the enormous population that occupies the palace today. The beautiful things that had survived the siege were gradually buried under layers of function. The observatory's speculum was never repaired. Thus, the inner gardens became increasingly difficult to maintain as the planet died around them. The Hall of Victories still exists, but how many people working in the administrative levels above it have any idea it is there, or what it contains? What remains is something that carries the memory of grandeur in its bones, but wears the face of necessity. A place that was built to last forever, and has, but at the cost of everything that originally made it worth preserving. Part 3. The Outer Palace. City of billions, most people who live in the Imperial Palace will never see the inner portions of it. Most people who work there will spend their entire lives in the Outer Palace, which is itself so vast and so densely inhabited that it functions as many distinct societies layered one on top of another, is each with its own customs and its own understanding of what life in this place means. Imagine walking through a city where every direction you look, the architecture speaks of power and faith and time. The administrative spires rise hundreds of meters above you, their surfaces carved with reliefs depicting the Emperor's great victories, the names of fallen heroes, passages from the Imperial Creed in scripts that range from flowing calligraphy to blocky militaristic fonts depending on which era of construction produced the wall you are looking at. Vox horns the size of freight containers boom out the hour prayer at regular intervals, a sound so large and so constant that people who have lived here long enough literally do not hear it anymore. Incense burns from sensors on chains as wide as a person's arm span, from the smoke settling into the lower levels in perpetual aromatic fog. Servitors move in their programmed columns, the faint whir and click of their augmetics audible beneath the constant background noise of too many humans living too close together. The higher functional levels of the outer palace are where the working adepts live and labor. These are the human beings who actually do the work of managing the Imperium: scribes, archivists, logisticians, tithe assessors, data entry functionaries, military requisition analysts, ecclesiastical compliance auditors. The titles go on essentially without limit, each one representing a specific, narrow function within the vast machinery of imperial governance. Or a mid-level adept in the outer palace might spend their entire career, 40 or 50 years of working life, processing a single category of information from a single administrative subsector of the Imperium, never knowing what happens to that data after it leaves their desk, never knowing whether the reports they spend their days generating are ever read by anyone. The work is essentially invisible to those who perform it, in the sense that no individual piece of it is identifiable as meaningful from the inside. Their physical existence is considerably more comfortable than those below them in the social hierarchy, which is less a compliment to their circumstances than a reflection of how grim those lower circumstances are. Working adepts have their own sleeping quarters, small, Spartan, shared in some cases, but genuinely their own in the sense that nobody else has a right to occupy them. The food is regular and adequate, if not inspiring. The uniform they wear identifies their role and their rank in the hierarchy, which provides a structure that many people find genuinely comforting in a place so large and so complex that structure is the only thing preventing cognitive dissolution. There is a culture among the adepts that outsiders sometimes find difficult to understand, a quietness, a patience, a way of accepting the repetitive demands of the work not as something to be endured, but as something to be performed correctly. The Imperial Creed is not merely a religious system in the outer palace, it is the framework that makes the work meaningful. Every data slate correctly filed is a service to the Emperor. Every tithe properly recorded is a contribution to the continued existence of the species. The adept who processes shipping manifests for a living understands, at some level that may be more faith than reason, that their correct processing of those manifests is part of what keeps the lights on across a million worlds. Below the working adepts, in the lower levels and the outer fringes of the outer palace, lives a very different population. The lore describes these people quietly, but without softening the picture. They are destitute, millions of them. People who came to the palace from across Terra, seeking employment in the administratum and did not find it, or who found it and lost it, or who were born to families who had been waiting in the queue for generations and had simply become permanent residents of the waiting space by default. Thus, the outer palace's lower reaches are a slum by any honest definition. There is no natural light at these depths and hasn't been for as long as anyone currently alive can remember. The air recyclers are ancient and unreliable in ways that the maintenance records document, but that nobody with the authority to repair them has prioritized doing so. The food, when there is food, comes in the form of nutrient paste from dispensaries that are perpetually, chronically understocked. The architecture around the destitute residence is still technically the outer structure of the most important building in human history, which means the ceilings are vaulted and the walls are carved and the floors are, in places, made of stone worn smooth by 10,000 years of footsteps. None of this provides warmth or nutrition or safety. Every day, thousands of desperate people queue up outside the major governmental office buildings of the outer palace, seeking employment. This is literal, real queues, composed of real human beings, standing in physical lines that stretch for hundreds of meters and sometimes for kilometers, composed of people waiting for the chance to be assessed for the position of menial, not administrator, not archivist, not any kind of skilled role, menial, the people who clean the corridors and operate the service lifts and transport the physical objects that the adepts above them need moved. The queue for this opportunity is so long and so intense that violence erupts regularly. The Adeptus Arbites are permanently stationed throughout the outer palace, with a specific mandate to manage what the law calls, with a matter-of-factness that is itself disturbing, the queue riots. This is a recurring event with an established response protocol. The Arbites shock troopers who handle these situations are not particularly gentle about it. They are enforcers of imperial law in an environment where imperial law has very little patience for disorder, and even less for the kind of poverty that generates disorder in the first place. The people in those queues are not criminals by any standard definition. They are hungry and desperate and competing for something they genuinely need. And when they push too hard, and the line becomes a crowd, and the crowd becomes a riot, Arbites with power mauls and suppression equipment move in, and the situation is resolved at the cost of whatever it costs. And yet, and this is the genuine complexity of the outer palace, it is also a place of real faith, of real beauty in unexpected corners, and genuine community among those who have figured out how to sustain it. The pilgrims who stream into the outer reaches of the palace complex from across all of Terra's surface are a constant presence, and they bring with them the devotional culture of 100 different worlds, 100 different regional traditions of the imperial creed that fill the outer spaces with chanted prayers in dozens of languages, with small shrines erected around any significant architectural feature, with the particular tenderness of people who believe they are standing in sacred space. The Column of Glory is one of the structures that pilgrims specifically seek out in the outer areas they are permitted to access. What it is a massive crystalline pillar rising 1/2 kilometer under a vaulted dome, so high that clouds form to obscure its frescoed arcs. The pillar itself is studded with hundreds of shattered suits of Space Marine power armor, blood angels, white scars, imperial fists, warriors who died defending this place 10,000 years ago during the Siege of Terra. Their bones still hang within those suits. Their skulls look out through open faceplates with the permanent expression that skulls always have, which somehow manages to be both unsettling and peaceful at the same time. The Column of Glory is one of the holiest public spaces in the outer palace, and it is genuinely moving in a way that the lore captures honestly. This is a place where the sacrifice of 10,000 years ago is physically present in a way that nothing else could replicate. The Palatine Arc represents the opposite extreme of the outer palace's social spectrum. Located near the Europa Wall, it is an ornate and affluent area, a district of fine residences and careful maintenance, where high-level administratum officials maintain private quarters that would constitute mansions on any other world. The contrast between the apartments of a senior administratum official in the Palatine Arc and the sleeping spaces of the destitute in the lower outer levels is not hundreds of meters away in physical terms. It is accessible. The people in those lower spaces can look up and see the buildings above them. And that proximity is not an accident of geography. It is the natural result of a place where value is measured in institutional rank and nothing else, where proximity to power is everything, and the distance between the powerful and the powerless is measured in nothing but credential. The Katabatic Plain is the windswept expanse that surrounds the entire palace complex, kept clear of construction by ancient laws that prohibit building too close to the outer walls. On a world where a single square meter of land costs more than a palace on any hive world, this open space is genuinely remarkable. The people who live closest to the walls exist at both extremes. The wealthy who pay extraordinary amounts for a view of something that has no equal in the galaxy, and the completely destitute who shelter against the walls because the walls, at least, stop some of the wind. And then there are the pilgrims who have not yet managed to get inside the walls at all. Billions of people from across the Imperium, from 1,000,000 worlds, traveling in pilgrim fleets that have been traveling for generations to reach Terra and prostrate themselves before whatever portion of the Emperor's presence they can get close to. Many of these individuals began their journey as children and will arrive as elderly people. Some will not arrive at all. The pilgrimage ships experience everything that ships in the Imperium experience. Warp storms, Xenos attacks, mechanical failures, disease outbreaks, and the ones who complete the journey and actually set foot on Terra discover that reaching the planet is only the beginning of a waiting process that may itself take years before they get anywhere near the palace walls. The stories of pilgrims who make it into the outer areas of the palace are full of an intensity of experience that secular language genuinely struggles with. The sheer physical scale of the walls, the carved reliefs, the constant sound of prayer, the smell of incense and humanity, the sense of being part of something much larger than oneself. These are experiences that the Imperial Creed has been generating intentionally for 10,000 years. And every architectural decision in the outer palace was made with the understanding that the people who move through these spaces would be carrying a religious weight with them, and that the environment should meet that weight and raise it. Part 4. Walls, gates, and the defences of a god's home. Before we move deeper into the palace complex, we need to understand the scale of how this place protects itself. Because the defences of the Imperial Palace are not simply large, they represent some of the most sophisticated military thinking in the history of the species, refined over 10,000 years of maintaining and improving a fortress that has been the target of some of the most powerful forces ever assembled. The outer walls reach 1,500 meters at their tallest points and 1,000 meters at their widest. And inside those walls are entire functional cities, power generation, munitions handling, aircraft support, barracks for hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Defense towers consisting of massive gun citadels run every 100 meters along their length. This is the physical boundary, and it is extraordinary, but it is only the beginning. The Aegis is the void shield array that protects the palace from orbital bombardment and large-scale energy attack. Designed by the Adeptus Mechanicus and described in the lore as perhaps the most sophisticated void shield system in the Imperium, the Aegis is not a single shield, but a multi-layered self-repairing network. If one layer fails, the next absorbs what penetrates. The mathematics of this system would require an Adeptus Mechanicus Magos to fully explain, and even they might have difficulty accounting for some of the array's more unusual properties, since it was built with Dark Age of technology components that the current Mechanicus do not entirely understand. Beyond the Aegis, the palace is protected by the permanent presence of Titan forces. The Collegia Titanica, the walking god machines of the Imperium, maintain forces here that dwarf what most world governors can call upon in their defense. The Legio Ignatum, whose 2 Warhound Scout Titans stand permanent vigil at the Eternity Gate, is only the most visible of these commitments. A Warhound Scout Titan is a war machine roughly 15 meters tall, armed with weapons capable of destroying armored formations, powered by a plasma reactor that burns with the heat of a small sun. 2 of them stand as doormen. The Lion's Gate and its associated spaceport handle the main supply flow to the palace. The Grand Processional of the Eternals, 300 meters wide, leads from the Lion's Gate Plaza inward, and its scale was designed with military intent as much as ceremonial one. An army in full parade formation looks small on it, which is the point. The anterior gate separates the outer regions from the approach to the Lion's Gate itself, and various other access points exist throughout the complex, each managed by layers of authority that escalate the closer you get to the center. The Avenue of Sacrifice sits outside the Ascensor's Gate, and deserves particular mention because it represents the human cost of maintaining the palace's most important defenders. The noble houses of Terra bring their infants here for assessment by the Adeptus Custodes. The finest are taken, not conscripted. The honour of having a child selected is genuinely, deeply felt by the families involved, but taken nonetheless, removed from their families to begin a process of transformation so extensive that the person who emerges at the other end shares only genetics with the child who entered. This has been happening since before the Horus Heresy. It will continue happening for as long as there are noble houses on Terra with children worth taking. The Eternity Wall and Eternity Wall Spaceport provide the secondary supply point and the secondary defensive access. was the celestial citadel at the Eternity Wall's southern tip was once described as being as large as any hive city in its own right, a structure that reached beyond Terra's atmosphere before Rogel Dawn cut it down during the Horus Heresy to bring it within the Aegis's protection zone. Even cut down, it hosts emissaries from the Jovian Void clans, ambassadors from Xenos powers permitted to maintain diplomatic presence, representatives of the navigator houses, and naval dynasts. A reminder that the palace, for all its sacred exclusivity, is also a centre of practical interstellar diplomacy. The Bab Bastion and the Fortress of the Lord Commander, militant of the Imperial Guard, are the major command nodes within the defensive network, where the chains of military authority connect and from which large-scale operations can be coordinated. As the Lord Commander's fortress is described as deliberately bleak, a heavy structure designed to withstand orbital bombardment, built like a field bunker rather than like a building, because the person who occupies it is a general first and everything else second. What is perhaps most remarkable about the palace's defences is not their scale or their sophistication, but the fact that they have been maintained in operational readiness for 10,000 years without ever being tested to their limits after the siege. Every weapon calibrated, every void shield generator maintained, every titan serviced, every soldier trained, for 10 millennia in a galaxy where almost everything eventually fails through entropy, neglect, or enemy action. Was the defences of the Imperial Palace have been held in a continuous state of readiness because the alternative, letting them slip and discovering on the wrong day that they are no longer what they were, is not an acceptable risk. This is part of what the palace is, a sustained act of will against entropy, maintained across 10,000 years by the combined effort of billions of people who may not understand the whole of what they are contributing to, but who each understand their piece of it well enough to keep it working. Part 5. The Adeptus Custodes. The 10,000, they are known by many names. The 10,000, their original full strength, reached by the time of the Horus Heresy and maintained in the 41st Millennium. The Golden Legion, the Watchers of the Throne, the Brotherhood of Demigods, the Companions, the Guardians. Well, but most simply, they are the Custodians, and they are the most individually capable warriors in the history of human civilization, where Space Marines are extraordinary, genetically modified transhuman warriors who represent one of the Imperium's most significant military investments. The Custodians exist in a different category. The Astartes program was designed for production at scale, tens of thousands of warriors organized into chapters. Each chapter a coherent military force capable of independent planetary operations. The process that creates a Space Marine is complex, but it is reproducible, documentable, teachable. It can be delegated. The process that creates a custodian cannot be delegated. The Emperor personally oversaw the making of each one. Every custodian is a unique individual in a way that even the most experienced Astartes is not just in personality, but in the specifics of their physical and psychological transformation. The genetic and biological modifications that produce a custodian are more extensive than those that produce a Space Marine, but they are also less standardized, tailored to the specific individual in ways that require a degree of precision and personalization that only the Emperor himself was capable of providing. The result is a warrior who is larger, faster, more durable, more sophisticated in every relevant martial and cognitive dimension, and possessed of a biological immortality that means a veteran custodian may have been standing watch for 1,000 years or more. Their equipment is commensurate with their nature. Every piece of armor and every weapon owned by a custodian is custom made for that specific individual. There is no standard issue. The armory of the custodians contains technologies drawn from humanity's dark age, weapons whose designs were fought over in wars that predate the Imperium itself, held exclusively by the 10,000, not shared with the Adeptus Mechanicus, or any other institution, regardless of how much the Mechanicus would like them. This is a source of what one might charitably call productive tension between the two organizations. and what one might less charitably describe as the Mechanicus quietly simmering about it for 10,000 years. The Guardian's spear that every custodian carries is an implement combining bolter, power weapon.
Okay, I want to step out the lore for just a second and give you my honest take on all of this, because after going deep on the palace lore, something really stuck with me. What gets me is that the Emperor built a palace full of beauty, gardens, an observatory, a private museum of humanity's greatest inventions. He kept the Mars rover, he painted, and then the heresy happened. And Dorn ripped most of it out to build walls, and 10,000 years of bureaucracy buried the rest. And nobody even noticed it was gone, because the institution never stopped to grieve it. That's the part that actually unsettles me about the palace. Not the scale, not the sacrifices, not even the dying god on the throne. It's the fact that something that has started as an act of genuine hope became something that runs entirely on necessity. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
As a melee functions in a single elegant design that has been associated with the custodians since before most of the rest of the Imperium existed, it appears on their banners and badges. When a custodian holds one at rest, it is a declaration of identity. When a custodian holds one raised in the combat stance, the declaration being made is considerably more direct. The blood games are the cornerstone of custodian training and operational readiness in the palace environment, and they deserve more detail than they usually receive. An individual custodian, stripped of their armor and identity, is sent out into the palace and sometimes into the broader hives of terror, with the assignment of penetrating the palace's own defenses and reaching the Emperor. Not successfully. The exercise ends when they are caught or when a time limit expires. But in between, they use every skill available to them: infiltration, impersonation, social manipulation, improvised weapon construction, political leverage, the exploitation of bureaucratic systems. They learn to think the way an assassin thinks. They learn to see the palace the way an enemy would see it. The records suggest that the Blood Games were at least partially inspired by an event involving the Primarch Alfarius, the twin Primarch of the Alpha Legion, legendary masters of infiltration and manipulation. Alfarius allegedly managed to infiltrate the Imperial Palace in the Great Crusade era, assume the identity of a custodian, and compromise a defense turret to the point where it could theoretically have shot the Emperor's shuttle out of the sky. Whilst the response by Constantine Valdor, the first and greatest Captain General of the Custodians, was characteristic. He did not blame, he learned. The Blood Games formalized the lesson, turning the failure into a permanent feature of custodian training. By the 41st millennium, the Blood Games had evolved to address a specific challenge. For most of the 10,000 years since the Horus Heresy, the custodians never left the palace. They had no opportunity to test themselves against the genuine threats that existed in the wider galaxy. The solution was grim and pragmatic in equal measure. A specialized corps was tasked with capturing suitable opponents, including Chaos Space Marines, renegade forces, skilled operatives of various kinds, and releasing them inside the palace complex. Real threats are genuinely trying to complete their objectives or survive, facing custodians who needed to test their skills against real stakes. The opponents did not generally succeed, but sometimes they came close enough to reveal something worth knowing, and that was considered worth whatever it cost. The companions are an elite within the elite, the 300 custodians who form the personal bodyguard that never leaves the Emperor's immediate vicinity. They stand in the Sanctum Imperialis. They guard the throne itself. They have watched over a dying god for 10,000 years with a constancy that is, depending on how you look at it, either the most noble or the most heartbreaking thing in the Imperium's story. These 300 warriors are the closest living things to the Emperor at almost every moment. Hence, they have seen things in the depths of the Sanctum that no one else has seen, and they carry that knowledge in silence. The culture of the custodians around their vigil is defined by a weight that sits differently on beings of their capabilities than grief sits on ordinary humans, but sits on them nonetheless. After the Horus Heresy, they changed their cloaks from red to black. The lore is clear about why. This was a gesture of mourning and penance. The emperor had been mortally wounded in their care, even if no individual custodian could have prevented what happened. The Black Cloak said, "We remember. We know what was lost here. We carry that." They kept those black cloaks for 10,000 years. It took Robuta Guilliman's return and the opening of the Era Indomitus to prompt a return to red. The implication is that the mourning, the penance, continued for exactly as long as the custodians believed it should, and not one day less. That is something about their character that is worth understanding. Custodians do not accumulate brotherhood the way Space Marines do. The Astartes process deliberately builds bonds of unit cohesion, brothers who would die for each other without calculation, forged by shared experience into something more than individual warriors. The custodians are deliberately different. They are individual sovereigns, each one preparing their equipment alone rather than on parade, each one carrying their own history inscribed on the inside of their armor. Constantine Valdor's armor held 1,932 names when Terra was besieged. Each one an action, a decision, a moment of service recorded in metal when no one else could read it. Private history, the weight of specific deeds carried close to the skin. A custodian who believes themselves no longer fit for duty does not simply retire. They leave the palace in a hooded black cloak, their identity concealed, and they go into the galaxy. They become what the lore calls watchers, figures of legend and rumor on distant worlds, anonymous observers who sometimes intervene in events that no one will ever know they influenced. The galaxy is large and dark and dangerous, and somewhere in it, at any given moment, there are gold-armored figures traveling incognito who have been standing watch since before most of the star systems they visit were colonized. Part 6. The Inner Palace, where history breathes access to the Inner Palace, is not a bureaucratic matter. It is a matter of surviving the assessment of the Adeptus Custodes, which operates according to standards that are not published and are not negotiable. No chapter master, no inquisitor lord, no sector governor possesses an automatic right of entry. They may request access. The custodians will decide. The decision may take time. The decision may be no. The Hall of Heroes begins the approach to the Sanctum Imperialis from within the Inner Palace. A grand hall, a soaring space that stretches for a mile, lined from floor to ceiling with banners, the battle standards of every Astra Militarum regiment and Space Marine chapter that has ever served the Emperor loyally, stretching back to the foundation of the Imperium. Ancient fabric, 10,000 years preserved and more, maintained by whatever combination of technology and devotion the palace's archivists have brought to the task. Banners from regiments that no longer exist, banners from chapters whose home worlds are now dust, banners from conflicts that no living human witnessed, placed here to prevent them from being entirely forgotten. The banner of Lord Commander Solar Macarius hangs here, the man who conquered 1,000 worlds in 7 years, the greatest imperial military commander of the post-heresy era, a figure whose legend has been used to motivate imperial troops for 5,000 years. Standing before his standard and understanding what it represents is not an intellectual exercise. It is an emotional one. The Hall of Heroes was designed to produce exactly that response, the full physical weight of human history and human sacrifice, concentrated in fabric and metal and dye and thread, and the specific gravity of things that mattered to specific people who are long dead. Roboute Guilliman walked this hall on his return to Terra. The lore describes him as being genuinely moved by it, despite the fact that he is a Primarch, a being created with the purpose of war, possessed of capabilities that dwarf those of almost anything else the Imperium fields, a figure who was present for the founding of most of what is commemorated here. Even he felt the weight of those banners. The Hall of Leng is sealed in the 41st Millennium, and has been for a long time. What it contained, the Emperor's private space for thinking at scales ordinary minds cannot reach, a place existing in a peculiar relationship with the fabric of space-time, remains inside it presumably, but inaccessible. Whether the Emperor's interment in the Golden Throne, and the subsequent expansion of his life support machinery has somehow invaded or altered the Hall of Leng is one of the questions the lore does not answer. There is something fitting about that. Not everything about the Emperor's palace should be knowable. The great observatory's obsidian speculum has never been repaired after the Siege of Terror, and the observatory itself, 2,000 meters tall and 4 kilometers wide, built from solid marble, sits with the quiet heaviness of something that was once used and is no longer. The portraits of astronomers etched into its walls, Galileo, Hypatia, Tycho Brahe, and others whose names appear in the lore as specific honorees, still look out from their positions on walls that are no longer regularly visited by people who understand what they were looking at or why the Emperor chose those faces. This is one of the palace's quieter tragedies. The knowledge of why things were done is often the first thing lost when the people who did them are gone. The Tower of Heroes is the single black structure in a city of gold and marble, and it rises from the inner palace like a statement of grief that has outlasted the grief itself. The Bell of Lost Souls at its summit is attended by hundreds of people whose entire existence is devoted to maintaining its function and readiness. Hundreds of individuals across generations whose life's work is a bell that rings very rarely. When it does ring, yes, it rings once for each fallen hero whose death has been judged significant enough to warrant the bell, and the sound is loud enough to rupture the eardrums and lungs of any unshielded human being in the belfry or its immediate vicinity. All palace servants in the relevant area must be evacuated before the bell rings. The evacuation protocol, the unlocking of 103 ciphers, the awakening of the continental communications relays. The entire process takes nearly 8 hours. The legend says that when the bell rings, the Emperor hears it even in his long sleep and sheds a single tear. Nobody knows if this is true. The existence of the legend tells you something about the people who live and work in the palace, about what they need to believe about the being at the center of it all. As if they need to believe that he still feels something, that the machinery has not entirely replaced the man, that somewhere inside the desiccated shell in the sanctum, there is still something that can grieve, and that grieves for the right things. Part 7. The Senatorum Imperialis, where the galaxy is governed in a great chamber whose architecture was designed to communicate the permanence of power. 12 people meet to decide the fate of 1,000,000 worlds. The High Lords of Terror hold the positions that the Emperor cannot hold, exercise the authority that the Emperor cannot exercise, and make the decisions that an empire of 1,000,000 inhabited worlds generates in quantities that would overwhelm any conceivable individual, even if the Emperor were fully present and fully functional. They are, officially, the Lords Temporal, Martial, and Ecclesiarchical of the most divine and righteous Imperium of mankind, a title so elaborately formal that it exists primarily in documents and formal proclamations. In practice, they are the 12 most powerful individuals in the galaxy and the body through which an empire functions, or tries to. The Senatorum Imperialis was established by Reboot Gilliman in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, taking the earlier Council of Terror as its foundation and formalizing it into something with more structural permanence. A body whose legitimacy derived from institutional position rather than from personal relationship with the Emperor, because the Emperor was no longer in a position to maintain personal relationships. 9 of the 12 seats are effectively permanent in their occupancy: the Ecclesiarch, the Master of the Administratum, and the Fabricator General of Mars, the Grand Provost Marshal, the Lord High Admiral of the Imperial Navy, the Master of the Officio Assassinorum, the Master of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the Paternova of the Navigators, and occasionally the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes when they choose to attend. These institutions are the pillars of the Imperium's function, and their representatives at this table are, at any given moment, among the most powerful beings in human space. The 3 remaining seats are more fluid, competed for by institutions whose influence rises and falls with circumstances and politics and the specific needs of specific eras. This fluidity is a genuine source of political energy within the Senatorum, the institutions that seek those seats, and the individuals within those institutions who maneuver for the positions represent a constant churn of ambition and calculation that defines the political texture of the palace at its highest levels. The Captain General carries a unique authority that technically outranks everyone else in the room when they choose to assert it. The Emperor, in an ancient decree that has never been formally overturned, established that the Captain General speaks with the Emperor's voice in the Emperor's absence. This makes the Captain General the theoretical supreme authority of the Imperium when the Emperor cannot speak, which is all the time. In practice, as a custodian holding that authority over 12 extremely powerful institutional representatives would have created a situation so politically untenable that it would have paralyzed governance entirely. And the early post-heresy period reached a practical arrangement. The High Lords govern the Imperium. The Captain General ensures the security of the palace and the Emperor, and the two work in parallel rather than in hierarchy. When the Captain General does attend a session, everyone in the room understands implicitly that this individual has the ability to dissolve the meeting, override any decision, or exercise direct imperial authority in a way that none of the others can technically match. This is not a comfortable dynamic for the High Lords, and it is not intended to be. The decisions made in the Senatorum are staggering in their scope. Only the High Lords can authorize a new Space Marine founding, the creation of a new chapter of Astartes, a decision that involves committing resources, genetic material, and institutional attention on a scale that exceeds most planetary economies. Only they can sanction a full-scale crusade, mobilizing the military resources of segmentum-level fleets and armies. Their edicts set in motion the black ships that collect psychers from across the galaxy. When an Inquisitor invokes the ultimate sanction, exterminatus, the destruction of an entire world, that judgment operates within a legal framework that the Senatorum ultimately defined and that the Senatorum is ultimately responsible for having created. The political intrigue within the Senatorum is not merely backstory flavor. It is an ongoing, active, frequently violent element of the palace's daily reality. High Lords have been assassinated by other High Lords. The beheading in the 32nd Millennium saw Draken Vangerich, the Grand Master of Assassins, murder all 12 High Lords simultaneously and rule the Imperium effectively alone for 11 years before being pulled down by Space Marine chapters, who judged that enough was enough. The Reign of Blood, when Goj Vandire accumulated both the position of Ecclesiarch and Master of the Administratum, and used that combination to declare the Senatorum irrelevant and himself the supreme authority, lasted long enough to tear apart entire planetary systems before ending in his death at the hands of his own bodyguards. These are not isolated incidents. They are part of a pattern that defines what governance looks like when the being at the center of the system cannot communicate, and the institutional checks on power are maintained only by agreement among the powerful. The Senatorum functions because the High Lords, most of the time, understand that the alternative to functioning is something worse, but most of the time is not the same as always, and the history of the palace is partly a history of what happens in the gaps. By the late 41st millennium, Reboot Gilliman chairs the Senatorum as Imperial Regent. His presence changes the dynamics of the room in ways that 10,000 years of institutional politics cannot entirely account for. He is a Primarch. He fought beside the Emperor. He created the very structure he now chairs, which the High Lords who sit across from him are, by any practical measure, outclassed in nearly every relevant dimension: military, political, historical, philosophical. They know this. He knows this. The question of how power operates in that room is one that the most current 40K lore is exploring in ways that are genuinely interesting to watch unfold. Part 8. The Eternity Gate and the path through the Eternity Gate stands at the convergence of everything the palace represents, both as architecture and as theology. It is the physical culmination of the approach from the Lion's Gate, the end of the Grand Processional and the Royal Ascension and the Hall of Heroes. A mile of accumulated history, of tattered battle standards and the weight of every army that has ever served, leading to a single portal that represents the boundary between the governed and the divine. The gate itself is built from tempered adamantium, layered with ceramite, two of the most structurally extraordinary materials in the Imperium, combined in quantities that suggest the builder was not particularly concerned with the cost. The outer surface is beaten gold, sculpted by artists whose names have not survived into the 41st millennium, into an enormous heroic depiction of the Emperor in the Great Crusade era, standing triumphant over his enemies. This image, the Emperor as active, vital, conquering force, rather than as the broken form in the Golden Throne, is the image that the imperial faith has canonized. Whether it is still accurate in any meaningful sense is a theological question that the ecclesiarchy has chosen to answer by simply not asking. Two warhound titans stand at the gate. The Legio Ignatum has maintained this duty since the early Imperium, and the specific titans assigned to it are among the most honored in that legion's history. They stand in the corridors of the inner palace at roughly 15 meters tall each, their weapons hot, their reactor signatures a permanent feature of the local energy readings. They are the last line of non-custodian defense before the sanctum itself. They have stood here through every political crisis, every external attack, every moment of imperial history for 10,000 years. If they think about the nature of their vigil, the law does not tell us. Perhaps the god machines simply stand and wait and are ready. Who passes through the gate? Almost nobody, and the law is clear and consistent about this. The Adeptus Custodes control access. No credential issued by any other imperial organization carries weight at this door. You may be a chapter master. You may be an inquisitor lord. You may be a planetary governor whose world feeds 100 billion people. None of that creates an automatic right to enter. You request access. The custodians assess you. If they judge you worthy, and the reason sufficient, you enter. If they do not, you do not. The astropaths who come here for soul binding are different from ordinary petitioners. They are brought here as part of an institutional process, assessed and prepared by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, and arriving at the palace as part of a continuous flow rather than as individual supplicants. The soul binding ritual, the linking of a psyker's psychic essence to the Emperor, a procedure that provides protection from the warp and a permanent fixed reference point for psychic navigation, requires proximity to the Emperor's presence. Not physical presence beside the throne itself, necessarily, but proximity sufficient for the Emperor's psychic awareness to reach out and mark the astropath as known. Almost all astropaths lose their physical sight during soul binding. The psychic overload burns out their optical nerves, as a side effect of what is effectively a direct line of contact between a human mind and the most powerful psychic presence in the galaxy. Thus they gain something in exchange, the ability to navigate psychic space with a certainty that ungifted humans cannot achieve, a degree of protection from the warp's more immediate dangers, and the sense of having been, however briefly, truly seen by something vast enough to see across stars. Those who survive the binding describe it as the most significant experience of their lives. Many of them can offer very few words for it that don't reduce to some version of overwhelming light. Some do not survive. The Emperor's psychic presence, even the fraction of it that reaches through the enormous distances and the layers of machinery and the 10,000 years of accumulated dampening to interact with the soul-binding candidates, is simply more than some human minds and bodies can withstand. Yet the Adeptus Astra Telepathica records these deaths accurately and processes them efficiently. They are not unexpected. They are not considered to reduce the value of the process. They are considered the acceptable cost of something essential. The Bridge of Ascension exists as a hidden passage into the sanctum from the catacombs beneath the palace, a secret known only to a very select few custodians. It is said to be the path by which the Emperor's broken body was carried from the vengeful spirit, after the battle with Horus, to the Golden Throne, where it has rested ever since. Hidden routes that only the most trusted know about are a characteristic feature of a place where security is understood at the level of architectural paranoia. Part 9. The Golden Throne, so where a god sits. The Golden Throne is the most important object in the Imperium of man, possibly the most important object in the observable galaxy. It is not what its name implies. The name evokes gold and ceremony and the legitimacy of rule. What the Golden Throne actually is, in the 41st millennium, is a massive cybernetic life support mechanism built from technology humanity has not understood for 10,000 years. It sustains a body that should have completed its death a very long time ago. It amplifies psychic powers to a degree that makes what would otherwise be impossible merely terrifying. It was originally designed to interface with the Aeldari webway, the trans-dimensional network of passages that the older species built to travel the galaxy without the risks of warp travel, and to carve a human passage through that network. As the Emperor's great, unrealized project, the Emperor found the throne as an ancient relic buried in the ruins beneath Asia. Even he was not entirely certain what it was or where it had come from. The lore is explicit that he was unsure whether the ideas he developed using it were his, or whether the artifacts he discovered had served as inspiration for something he then built, or whether he was operating a technology that predated him entirely. He spent considerable time restoring and modifying it, placing it in the deepest portion of what would become the palace. He used it to maintain his psychic presence in the warp while his physical form sat still. He used it to protect the human-built section of the webway from the constant pressure of chaos energies. Then Magnus the Red, in a moment of catastrophic well-meaning, punched through the Emperor's psychic defenses to warn him about Horus. The breach in the shield around the webway portal was the result, and through that breach poured demonic entities in numbers that the custodians and Sisters of Silence had to fight through for years. The Emperor, trapped on the throne to hold the breach sealed, could not pursue Horus, could not prevent the heresy from reaching its final stage. The war in the webway was fought in complete secrecy while the entire Great Crusade spun into civil conflict above it, and it cost more than the official histories have ever fully acknowledged. After the Siege of Terror, after the Emperor was mortally wounded in his confrontation with Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit, he was placed on the Golden Throne and has not left since. Was his body, already damaged beyond any capacity for ordinary healing, has been decaying for 10,000 years, held in a functional state only by the machinery's intervention and the absolute refusal of the mind within it to complete the process of dying. What is preserved is not life in any meaningful biological sense. What remains of his physical form in the late 41st millennium is described in terms that do not soften the reality. A desiccated shell, the last cells maintained by ancient technology, a form that no longer breathes or moves or responds to external stimuli in any way that could be observed. And yet his presence in the warp is immense. The chaos gods themselves, beings of infinite malice and ancient power, who regard humanity primarily as a food source and an entertainment, call him the anathema, not with mockery, but with something that registers in the specific language the law uses for entities who do not experience fear as humans do, as recognition of a genuine counterforce. The most powerful manifestations of chaos in the galaxy have a specific word for the Emperor, and that word acknowledges that he opposes their nature in a way that nothing else does. The daily sacrifice that maintains the throne is one of the grimmer constants of Imperium life when you look at it directly. Approximately 1,000 psychers consumed every day, drawn from the black ships that arrive at Terra continuously, collected from 1,000,000 worlds through the operations of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, assessed and allocated and eventually brought to the sanctum to serve their final purpose. Their psychic energy flows into the throne's mechanisms, sustaining the Emperor's biological functions and fueling the Astronomicon. Their bodies are afterward. There is no gentle way to say this, of no further use. The scale of this escalates over the millennia. By the late 36th millennium, the demand had already risen beyond the original numbers. By the early 41st millennium, some sources indicate 4 times the original daily requirement. The black ships sail more frequently, the collections are larger, the psychers of the Imperium are, if they are brought to Terra at all, a resource that is allocated based on need rather than preference, and the greatest need is always the throne. The Astronomicon that all of this sustains is the nervous system of the Imperium, the psychic beacon that burns on Terra and extends approximately 50,000 light-years across the galaxy. It's the signal that allows navigator-guided warp travel across Imperial space. Without the Astronomicon, warp navigation becomes essentially impossible beyond very short distances. Without warp navigation, the supply lines of the Imperium collapse. Without supply lines, 1,000,000 worlds begin to starve. Without trade and communication, the political coherence of the Imperium dissolves. Without political coherence, humanity becomes 1,000 separate civilizations, some of them prey, some of them dangerous in their own right, but all of them smaller and weaker than the whole they came from. The Noctis Eterna, the days of blindness after the Great Rift formed, and the Astronomicon went dark, showed the Imperium exactly what exists on the far side of the Emperor's continued function. 33 days on Terra without the Astronomicon's light, warp energies manifesting on the planet's surface, riots and starvation, and spreading madness in the most fortified world in the Imperium. Chaos cults operating openly in streets where they had never dared show themselves before. The palace itself held, but much of the hive infrastructure beyond its walls fell into a form of anarchy that took years to fully suppress. 33 days. The entirety of what the Imperium has built over 10,000 years came to the edge of dissolution in 33 days without the Emperor's light. This is the reality that the people in the Sanctum Imperialis, the custodians, the tech priests, the Sisters of Silence, live with every moment, not abstractly, with the acute awareness of people who understand precisely how fine the margin is and precisely what it costs to maintain it. As to Part 10, the Sanctum Imperialis, where gods breathe beyond the Eternity Gate, past the Hall of Heroes, into the deepening interior spaces of the Inner Palace, where the architecture shifts from ceremonial to functional to something that is neither and both at once, lies the Sanctum Imperialis, the official residence of the Emperor of Mankind, which in the 41st millennium means the place where his decaying body is maintained in the machinery of survival. The tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus's Ad Nector Concilium are among the very few permitted to enter the sanctum regularly. Their function is maintenance, the continuous, never-ending work of keeping the Golden Throne functional using techniques that are themselves imperfectly understood. The throne is a relic of the Dark Age of technology, was a period when humanity's science reached heights it has not approached since, a period whose knowledge was subsequently lost in the catastrophes of the Age of Strife. No one currently alive fully understands how the throne works. The tech priests who tend it are doing so through a combination of inherited technique, accumulated experience, sacred procedure, and the kind of faith-backed improvisation that the Adeptus Mechanicus would technically describe as liturgical maintenance, but which operates in practice a great deal like educated guessing. By the late 41st millennium, they have identified failures in the throne's mechanisms that are beyond their ability to repair. This is not a qualified statement or a hedged professional assessment. This is the Adeptus Mechanicus, the inheritors of Mars, was the keepers of all the technical knowledge that survives in the Imperium, saying clearly and without significant ambiguity that the most important machine in the galaxy is breaking in ways they cannot fix. The law treats this with the quietness of something so enormous that it cannot be processed through normal emotional channels. A civilization acknowledging that the load-bearing element of its existence is failing and continuing anyway because the alternative to continuing is not survivable. The Hall of Widows is the central expanse of the sanctum, the gathering space that precedes the innermost areas where the throne sits. The name is never explained in the lore, and the lack of explanation is somehow appropriate. This is not a space that explains itself, as it is vast and ancient, and carries the specific gravity of a place where the most significant thing in the world is happening continuously, and has been happening continuously for longer than most civilizations have managed to survive. The walls of the throne room itself are described as containing thousands of outlets connected to the golden throne, coffin-like devices into which psykers are placed to allow their energy to be drawn into the system. The daily sacrifices. The coffins are filled and the energy is taken, and the coffins are emptied and the process begins again. The lore is relatively sparse on the procedural details, which may be mercy. The visual image alone, thousands of coffin-shaped outlets in the walls of the most sacred space in the Imperium, and each one a temporary vessel for a dying human being, is sufficient to communicate the cost. The Sisters of Silence move through the sanctum in patterns that have been maintained for 10,000 years. They are null maidens, psychic blanks, human beings born without any presence in the warp, the precise inverse of psykers. Their existence creates zones of psychic silence, spaces where the warp cannot hear and where the warp's creatures cannot navigate. In the sanctum, where the Emperor's psychic presence is at its most concentrated and therefore most attractive to entities that would consume or corrupt it, the Sisters form a protective ring of nothing around the most powerful something in the galaxy. Here's the contrast between what they are, complete psychic absence, and what they protect, the brightest psychic beacon in the Imperium, is one of the setting's more elegant symmetries. The Talisman of Seven Hammers is a dead man's switch installed in the throne by Vulcan, the Salamander's Primarch, at the Emperor's direction. If the throne fails and the Emperor dies, the talisman detonates with sufficient force to destroy not only the Imperial Palace, but all of Terra. The Emperor chose to build this, the most powerful being humanity has produced, the figure around whom the Imperium's entire existence is organized, chose to ensure that if he dies, the planet he died on dies with him, specifically to deny the forces of chaos the satisfaction of standing on the throne world. There is something in this that illuminates the Emperor's character more clearly than almost anything else in the lore. He is not willing to simply be defeated. He builds his own last word into the machinery. Reboot Gilliman's description of standing in the Emperor's presence, recorded obliquely in various sources, speaks of an experience that even a Primarch finds difficult to process. A presence so vast that direct proximity to it requires a degree of psychic and psychological fortitude that transcends ordinary preparation. Even the custodians, being specifically created to withstand the Emperor's proximity, are described as sometimes falling to their knees in the sanctum, not as a chosen gesture of reverence, but as a physical reflex in response to something that the body recognizes as too large to remain standing before. What the Emperor is, in the sanctum in the 41st millennium, is not entirely either living or dead. It is a consciousness that occupies a body the way a tenant occupies a building that is slowly collapsing around them, sustained by machinery and will, performing functions that keep a galaxy alive, enduring an existence that the lore describes as unending torment. The Chaos Gods call him the Anathema. Perhaps the more honest description is the continuing. He continues, against all reason and biology and the basic logic of how matter works. He continues. Part 11. What it actually feels like to live here. We have built this picture from the outside in. The walls, the gates, the politics, the defenses, the deeper sanctums. Now I want to think about the human experience of this place on the most personal level. What does it feel like, day to day, to exist here? If you are a menial in the outer palace, one of the fortunate ones who secured a position, your day begins in a sleeping space that makes a ship's bunk feel generous. Shared with other people, in levels of the palace where there has never been natural light, where the air carries the permanent underlying scent of recycling systems that are older than most of the people using them. You eat before your shift, from a dispensary that is usually but not always stocked. You wear a color-coded uniform that communicates your function to every person who sees you. You walk a route that you have walked hundreds of times before and will walk hundreds of times again. Your work is repetitive in a way that the word repetitive does not really cover. You carry objects along specified routes. Should you operate mechanisms that other people are too important to operate themselves? You clean spaces that will need cleaning again tomorrow in exactly the same way. The palace is so vast and so full of people that your individual contribution to its function is, from any external perspective, essentially invisible. You are one maintenance function among billions, and yet you have a place, a defined function, regular nutrition, protection from the violence that claims people in the spaces outside your assigned route. By the standards of terror in the 41st millennium, this makes you among the fortunate. The adepts above you in the hierarchy have better physical circumstances, but not necessarily a greater sense of meaning. Their work is more specific and more skilled, but it is still work in a machine so large that its purpose is invisible from any single point within it. The adept who manages tithe records for a subsector for 30 years may never know whether those records were accurate, whether they mattered, whether anyone read them. What sustains them is the framework of faith that the Imperial Creed provides, the understanding that every correctly filed document is a service to the Emperor, that the work of the institution is the work of a god made flesh in administrative form. The pilgrims carry something different. For someone who has travelled across the galaxy, who has perhaps been travelling for years or decades, or their entire conscious life toward this destination, the first sight of the palace walls produces an experience that is not really comparable to anything in everyday life. These walls were built to produce exactly this effect. Every decision about their scale and their carving and their decoration was made by people who understood that this was a religious experience in architectural form. The walls communicate. You are small, and what you are approaching is vast. And vastness is appropriate when what you are approaching is the home of a god. A pilgrim who manages to stand before the eternity gate, even at the distance of the grand processional, even without entering, and look at the golden relief of the Emperor in his glory, the two titans standing motionless on either side, the mile of banners leading to that point, the specific weight of all that accumulated intention, that pilgrim is experiencing something that the Imperial Creed has been designed to produce for 10,000 years, as the sense of one's own smallness in relation to something genuinely worthy of smallness, the sense of having arrived, finally, at the source of the thing that has organized the whole meaning structure of one's life. And then, for almost all of them, the gate does not open. They turn around and make the long journey back through the processional, through the outer palace, through the approaches, back onto Terra's dark surface, and they carry what they saw with them for the rest of their lives. For the few who do enter the sanctum, the rare visitors, the soul-bound astropaths, the custodians themselves, the experience is uniformly described in terms of presence. Not the presence of a room or a building, the presence of something that is aware, the psychic emanations of the Emperor, are even filtered and dampened by 10,000 years of accumulated shielding, and the vast distances of the sanctum itself register to any sensitive mind as a warmth that comes from inside as much as from outside, as a light that has no apparent source, as the specific and overwhelming sensation of being noticed by something immense enough to notice everything simultaneously. People fall to their knees, not as theatre, not because they have been told to, because their bodies have received information that their minds cannot fully process, and the physical response is collapse. This is described across multiple sources as a genuine phenomenon, not ceremonial exaggeration. The Emperor's presence in the sanctum is not just spiritual, it is physical. It affects matter and mind, and the relationship between them in ways that the Adeptus Mechanicus has been documenting without fully understanding for 10,000 years. For the Adeptus Custodes, who stand their vigil in the sanctum, this presence is their constant environment. They have been standing in this space for years, for decades, for centuries in some cases, in the proximity of something that makes even brief visits overwhelming for ordinary visitors. The psychological demands of this vigil are never directly discussed in the lore, but they are present in the way the custodians are described. The black cloaks of mourning, the private names inscribed on their armour, the blood games that give them something active and challenging to do, or the sense that these are beings who are holding something together through pure consistency of will and finding that will continuously be tested by the proximity of what they are protecting and what that protection costs. The palace processes its dead efficiently. People die here every day, in the queues, in the lower levels, in the pilgrimage routes, in the maintenance corridors, at their desks. The institution records them and replaces them and continues. The bell of lost souls rings for those significant enough to warrant its ringing, and for the vast majority, it does not ring. They are logged and cremated and forgotten in the way that institutions inevitably forget the individuals who composed them. There is no cruelty in this exactly. There is simply scale. What the palace offers in exchange for the lives it consumes is meaning. As the adept who filed the same reports for 40 years in relative comfort was part of the machine that kept humanity alive. The menial who spent their life cleaning corridors was part of what allowed the adepts to work. The pilgrim who spent their entire journey and their entire life savings to stand briefly before the eternity gate experienced something that they will carry forever. The custodian who has stood vigil for 1,000 years has spent those years protecting the one thing that makes the survival of the species possible. Meaning in the Imperial Palace is not comfortable. It is not well distributed. It is not available in equal measure to everyone who lives here. The destitute in the lower outer levels do not have easy access to it, and the institution does not particularly exert itself to provide it to them. But the meaning is real. The function of this place is real. The cost it extracts is matched by the scale of what it preserves. And at the center of all of it, past the walls and the gates and the adepts and the soldiers and the custodians and the high lords and the hall of heroes and the eternity gate and the sisters of silence and the tech priests and the daily dead, sits a body that does not breathe, containing a mind that has not stopped working in 10,000 years, performing the impossible task of keeping the lights on for the species that built all of this around him. Part 12. The bureaucracy that holds a galaxy together. There is a dimension of the palace that tends to be underplayed in 40K discussions because it is not glamorous. It has no golden armor and no ancient weapons. What it does not involve the whispered authority of the Inquisition, or the thunderclap of Titan footsteps, or the terrifying proximity of the Emperor's presence. It involves paper, or the 41st Millennium equivalent of paper, which is data slates and parchment and wax seals and the endless, grinding, absolutely essential machinery of keeping records. The Administratum is the largest organization in the Imperium, not the Adeptus Mechanicus with its forge worlds and its sacred technologies, not the Ecclesiarchy with its billions of worshippers and its armies of devotion, not the Astra Militarum with its incalculable trillions of soldiers and its galaxy-spanning logistics. The Administratum, the bureaucracy itself, is larger than any of these. It employs a number of people that no one has successfully counted. Just because the Administratum is responsible for counting things, and any count it produced of itself would, by definition, be incomplete before it was finished. Estimates suggest that the working population of the administrative apparatus of the Imperium on Terra alone numbers in the tens of billions. The total number spread across 1 million worlds is a figure that the law wisely declines to specify. The Imperial Palace is the heart of the Administratum, and this matters in a very concrete sense. The archives of the Administratum extend for many kilometers beneath the surface of Terra in some places. Physical archives. Rooms filled with physical records in forms ranging from standard data storage to actual parchment to technologies that are poorly understood, even by the archivists who maintain them. Or says the oldest sections of the archive contain records whose reading systems no longer function. The machines designed to read certain types of storage media from the early Imperium broke down centuries ago and were never repaired because the information contained on those media was considered either adequately duplicated elsewhere or too old to be immediately relevant, and the resources required to restore the reading systems were better deployed on current operations. This is how the Imperium loses things. Not through dramatic events, not through enemy action or catastrophic failure. Through the quiet accumulation of deferred maintenance, of resources deployed on the immediate rather than the historical, of the inevitable entropy that claims everything if nobody fights it continuously enough. What the records of the Great Crusade are imperfect. The records of the Unification Wars are fragmentary. The records of what came before those are almost entirely gone, either destroyed in the Horus Heresy or lost in the preceding millennia, or stored on media that cannot be read by anything currently operational. And yet the current records are maintained with extraordinary precision. The current tithes, the current levies, the current deployment orders, the current census estimates, always imprecise, always the best available, always being revised. These are managed with a care that approaches devotion because the people who manage them understand that getting them wrong has consequences measured in worlds. A miscalculated tithe can leave a world unable to meet its obligations, which triggers assessments, which triggers sanctions, or which can escalate to judgments that end in exterminatus for what started as a clerical error. This is not a theoretical path. This is a path that has been travelled. The daily routine of an administratum, adept in the palace, is built around the prevention of that kind of error, the checking and double-checking, the chain of verification that flows through multiple levels of oversight, the specific prayers recited before certain categories of document are processed. These are not bureaucratic excess. They are the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years of learning what happens when you get it wrong. The prayers are genuine devotion, layered over practical procedure. The spiritual and the functional merged so thoroughly that trying to separate them would be like trying to remove salt from seawater. As the political dimension of the administratum's presence in the palace is considerable and rarely discussed in the heroic narratives. The master of the administratum is one of the most powerful High Lords of Terror, not because of any martial capability, but because the administratum controls information flow at the most fundamental level. Who gets the resources they need, when, and in what quantity? These are decisions that pass through the administratum's processes. An organization that controls information and resource flow at this scale can, if its leadership is willing, effectively starve out rivals, privilege allies, and shape the practical power landscape of the Imperium without raising a single weapon. This potential was demonstrated most dramatically by Goj Van Dyer, who used his dual role as ecclesiarch and master of the administratum to achieve something close to autocratic control of the entire Imperium during his reign of blood. The clerks and scribes and data analysts who fill the palace's administrative levels are not thinking about this dimension of their work when they process their daily documents. They are thinking about whether the figures are correct and whether the forms have been completed in the right format, and whether the seal applied to the document is the right seal for this category of authorization. The political power that flows from their collective accuracy is invisible to them. This is possibly how it should be. As an administrative class that is fully aware of its own leverage would be a different and more dangerous thing than one that simply does the work, because the work is what it does. The City of Sight is the headquarters of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica within the palace complex, the organization responsible for managing psychers, for the soul binding of astropaths, and for operating the black ships that collect psychically gifted individuals from across the Imperium. The name suggests something mystical, and the institution is both mundane and terrifying in equal measure. The collection of psychers across 1,000,000 worlds is one of the most logistically complex operations the Imperium undertakes. Each world must be assessed for psyker presence. The psychers present must be identified, assessed for power level and stability, is collected through processes that vary from willing participation to something that is not willing participation, transported in conditions designed to prevent the catastrophic possibilities that a ship full of uncontrolled psychers represents, and delivered to Terra for sorting. The sorting itself is a process. Some psychers are directed toward training for the astropath service, some toward other specialized roles within the Imperium's various psycher-dependent functions, sanctioned psychers for military units, navigators who are identified through channels other than the traditional navigator house structure, specialists for the Inquisition or the Grey Knights, or various other organizations that require psychic talent, and some are allocated to the throne's requirements, and their journey ends in the Sanctum Imperialis. While the individuals who make these allocation decisions, career administratum and astra telepathica officials who have risen through the ranks of their respective organizations to positions where they review files and make determinations, are not considered to have blood on their hands by the Imperium's moral framework. They are considered to be doing essential work. The allocation to the throne is the highest form of service a psyker can provide in the official position of the institution. The official position is technically true. Without that service, the throne fails, and the throne's failure is the end of everything. The official position does not dwell on what that service involves for the individual providing it. Deeper in the palace's administrative structure, was the Library Sanctus represents one of the most carefully guarded repositories of knowledge in the Imperium, a collection of texts and records and items whose access is controlled at levels that make ordinary palace security look casual. The Principa Collegiate functions as an academy and archive, housing ancient texts whose content ranges from historical record to material that the Inquisition would classify as requiring oversight. The dark cells hold items and individuals whose existence is not acknowledged in any document accessible to anyone below the most senior of authorizations. A secret prison and storehouse whose contents represent either the most dangerous remnants of humanity's technological past or the most dangerous individuals of humanity's institutional present, depending on which layer you are assessing. The Blackstone prison is a more openly acknowledged facility built from Cadian Blackstone, a material with natural anti-psychic properties. It serves as a holding facility for psychers and warp-touched individuals whose presence would otherwise represent a hazard to the palace's overall psychic stability. The individuals who arrived at the City of Sight or the Sanctum and were judged dangerous in ways that exceeded the standard allocation paths. Containment rather than allocation. The Blackstone absorbs and suppresses psychic activity, creating a null zone within which even powerful psychers are reduced to something closer to ordinary threat levels. The people held there are not comfortable. Cadian Blackstone, in the quantities used here, has effects on human physiology that go beyond simple psychic suppression, but they are contained, and containment is what the palace requires of them. All of this, the archives, the colleges, the dark cells, the City of Sight, the Black Prison, the administrative hives, and the political maneuvering, and the daily sacrifice of psychers, and the bell of lost souls, and the senatorum, and the custodians, and the eternity gate, exists within a single complex. A single, impossibly large, impossibly old, impossibly complex structure that has been growing and changing and accumulating its history for nearly 30,000 years, and that continues to grow and change today, and that has no prospect of stopping anytime soon because the function it performs is not optional. The Imperial Palace is not a monument to what humanity has been. It is the ongoing, functioning, imperfect, extraordinary machinery of what humanity currently is. And it contains the best and the worst of the species simultaneously, without apparent awareness of the contradiction, because the contradiction is the point. The contradiction is what the species looks like when you compress it to its essential form and demand that it keep working regardless of the cost. Part 13, the Imperial Dungeon and what lies beneath the palace does not only rise, it descends. And what lies beneath the visible Imperial complex is, in some ways, as significant as what towers above it. The Imperial Dungeon exists deep underground, built by the Emperor himself to serve as the foundation of his most ambitious project. The dungeon was originally the laboratory complex where the process of creating Space Marines was developed. Specifically, the research of the scientist Amara Astarte, who worked in these sub-levels to develop the Astartes gene seed program that would eventually produce the Space Marine legions. Astarte later destroyed her own laboratory during an event called the Palace Coup, an attempt to erase her own work that was not entirely successful, and the ruins of those original research spaces still exist somewhere in the deepest levels. Below the laboratory level, the dungeon contained something else entirely, a gate into the webway. The Eldari's transdimensional network of passages, capable of allowing travel between distant points in real space without exposure to the warp, runs beneath the surface of Terra through what the lore describes as natural or semi-natural formations of webway material. The Emperor found this gate and began his project to carve a human extension through it, to give humanity access to the webway, and thereby free interstellar travel from its dependence on the warp and its associated risks. The Webway project is one of the great might-have-beens of 40,000 history. If it had succeeded, the Astronomicon would not have been necessary in the same form. The sacrificial system that currently maintains the throne might not have developed. Warp travel's inherent dangers would have been circumventable for most purposes. The Imperium's relationship with the warp would have been fundamentally different. The Chaos Gods, who feed on and through the warp, would have found humanity considerably harder to reach. It did not succeed. But the breach created by Magnus the Red's psychic intrusion allowed demonic forces to pour through the Webway portal before it could be used for its intended purpose. The Custodians and Sisters of Silence fought a years-long secret war inside the Webway itself, holding back demonic incursion, while the Emperor sat on the throne above them, maintaining the portal's seal. The war was lost in the sense that the Webway project could not be completed. The portal was eventually closed, permanently, as far as anyone alive in the 41st millennium knows. What lies beyond that sealed gate, in the Webway below the Imperial Palace, is one of the setting's more compelling unanswered questions. The catacombs of Terra extend across a vast subterranean network beneath the planet's surface, accumulated across the same timescale as the surface architecture. The catacombs contain burial sites that predate the Unification Wars, chambers whose original purposes have been forgotten, passages that connect areas of the palace to areas of Terra outside the palace walls, through routes that are not documented on any public record. The Bridge of Ascension, the hidden passage into the sanctum from the catacombs, runs through this subterranean network. What else runs through it is not something the lore reveals comprehensively. The Webway gate itself, sealed now, the portal closed against intrusion from either side, sits in the deepest accessible portion of the dungeon, a reminder of the Emperor's greatest ambition and its failed ending. The Talisman of Seven Hammers connects to this area in ways the lore implies, but does not fully detail. If the throne fails and the talisman activates, as the explosion that follows would presumably collapse these deep levels entirely, sealing whatever remains in the Webway below them for whatever time remains to the galaxy. This is not a comforting thought. It was not intended to be. The Emperor built this place as a foundation for his most ambitious hope, and he built its deepest levels to function as a final statement of refusal when hope is gone. Part 14. The scale of time in the palace. One of the most striking dimensions of life inside the Imperial Palace is its relationship with time. Not the passage of time in the ordinary sense, but the simultaneous presence of multiple eras within a single space. The Adeptus Custodes, who stand guard at the Eternity Gate in the 41st millennium, have stood at that gate, or at similar posts within the palace, for centuries. Just some of them were present during the Horus Heresy. They remember the palace before the siege, before Rogel Dawn removed the Annapurna Gate and built the defensive bastions where the plazas used to be. They have watched the accumulation of 10,000 years of change happen slowly around them while they remained essentially static. Their armor bears the marks of battles fought across that entire span. Their names number in the hundreds, each one an action across centuries of service. This is not unique to the Custodians. The oldest tech priests of the Ad Nectar Concilium, who maintain the Golden Throne, have in some cases been at their posts for many centuries. The mechanical augmentation of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the replacement of biological components with technological ones, extends lifespan dramatically, and the most senior throne maintainers may have memories of previous configurations of the machinery that current generations have never seen. Their knowledge is irreplaceable in the most literal sense. When they die, what they know dies with them unless it has been adequately documented. And the documentation is never quite adequate. The palace's architecture carries this temporal layering visually. Walk from the outermost administrative sections toward the inner palace, and you walk through architectural eras. The functional, slightly brutal construction of the post-heresy expansion, the ornate, ceremony-focused construction of the Great Crusade era where it survived, the earlier, rougher construction of the Unification Wars period in the deepest accessible levels, and the original foundation structures that predate all of this. That belonged to whatever was here before the Emperor chose this location, before the Masonic guilds arrived, before the palace was a palace rather than a mountain. For the ordinary adepts and menials who live and work in these spaces, this temporal depth is mostly invisible. They know their section of the palace. They know their route. They know the specific appearance of the specific walls they pass every day. And they have never been to the sections where different architectural styles tell different stories. The palace is too large for most of its inhabitants to have any sense of its whole. They know their piece of it, the way a single cell in a body knows its immediate chemical neighborhood, with great precision and total ignorance of the larger scale. The pilgrims who come from distant worlds bring a different kind of temporal awareness. They carry the stories their grandparents told them about their grandparents' pilgrimages, the accumulated devotional memory of families that have been orienting themselves toward this destination for generations. For them, the palace is not a place that exists in a single time. It is a point that their family's history has been pointing toward across decades or centuries, and arriving at it means standing at the convergence of all that accumulated pointing. The temporal complexity of the palace means that any given moment inside it contains layers of meaning that extend far backward. The stone you stand on may have been trodden by individuals 10,000 years dead, whose names now appear on the banners in the Hall of Heroes. The corridor you walk may have been designed during the Great Crusade by architects who expected the palace to last forever and were right in a way they could not have anticipated. The recycled air you breathe has been breathed by everyone who ever lived here, which means it carries, in the most molecular and literal sense, the biological residue of the entire history of this place. This is not a comfortable thought, but it is a true one. The Imperial Palace is not just where the Imperium is, it is where the Imperium has been, and those two things are impossible to separate in a structure this old and this continuous. Part 15. The moment before the gate. I want to end the body of this journey with a thought experiment. Imagine you are a person who has been given access to the Imperial Palace, not to the sanctum, not to the inner chambers, but to stand at the end of the grand processional and look at the Eternity Gate. You have travelled far to get here. The journey was not comfortable. Terra is not a comfortable planet. The air tastes of centuries of compressed habitation. The sky above is a permanent industrial dusk that has not cleared in living memory. The people around you in the transit systems and the outer approaches of the palace are a combination of desperate pilgrims, hard-faced adepts, Arbites in full armour, who look at everyone as a potential threat, and servitors who look at nothing because they have been modified past the capacity to look. The palace itself, seen from the outside, is overwhelming in its scale. The walls are too large to hold in your visual field without turning your head. Just the gun citadels on the wall towers are the size of buildings. The katabatic plain that surrounds the palace is, by the standards of Terra, an almost shocking expanse of open space. You enter through the Lion's Gate. You follow the route inward through the outer palace, through the administrative and residential layers, through checkpoints where your credentials are verified by beings who regard you with the calm, thorough attention of people who take their work very seriously and have been taking it very seriously for longer than you have been alive. The scale of the space around you gradually shifts from the functional and chaotic density of the outer palace to something more ordered, more purposeful. The crowds thin, the architecture changes. The sense that you are moving towards something of significance becomes increasingly physical. You reach the grand processional, 300 meters wide. The banners begin. They line the way for a mile, floor to ceiling, ancient standards from armies that fought in battles, whose names you may know from catechism and whose reality you have never been close enough to feel. The sound of the outer palace fades. as you move deeper. The processional is not quiet. There are other people here, always, guards and staff, and the occasional visitor being escorted. But it has a different acoustic quality, a gravity. At the end of the mile of banners, the gate. It is taller than you expected, which is itself surprising because you knew it would be large, and you have been surrounded by large things for hours. The golden relief catches the artificial light in ways that make the Emperor's depicted figure seem to shift slightly when you move, or the play of gold and shadow creating an impression of motion in something that is absolutely still. Two 15-meter titans stand on either side of it, their weapons hot, their presence creating a specific kind of silence that the human body recognizes as dangerous even before the mind processes the reason. Behind the gate, somewhere in the structure that extends beyond it, sits the being that this building was built around, the being that the Imperium was built around, the being that the faith of hundreds of billions of people across 1 million worlds is directed toward in every moment of every day, whether they are in formal prayer or simply living their lives in a civilization that his existence makes possible. You cannot enter. The gate does not open for you. The custodians, golden and still at their posts, will watch you with an attention that is polite and absolute, and not remotely interested in your reasons or your feelings about them. You will turn around. You will walk the mile of banners back the way you came. You will exit through the checkpoints and the outer palace and the Lion's Gate and back onto the dark surface of terror. And you will carry what you saw with you. And what will you carry? The image of a gate, the weight of the banners, the specific quality of the light in that space where everything important converges and most people are turned away. That is enough. That is more than most people in the history of the species have ever had. The Emperor is on the other side of that gate. He has been there for 10,000 years. He will be there for whatever comes next. And the gate will hold, and the walls will hold, and the vigil will continue. Because the alternative to the vigil is the kind of darkness that the human mind is not equipped to face. The Emperor protects. Part 16, the closing thought. There is one more thing I want to sit with before we close. The question of what the Imperial Palace does to the people who spend their lives inside it. Not physically, but to their sense of who they are and what the world is. Human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures. Put us in almost any environment and give us enough time, and we will develop routines and communities and frameworks of meaning that make the environment livable. Put us in a cathedral and we develop reverence. Put us in a barracks and we develop discipline and solidarity. Put us in a slum and we develop the particular resilience and ingenuity of people for whom resilience is the only alternative to dissolution. The Imperial Palace does all of these things simultaneously to the billions of people within it, in different proportions depending on where in the complex they happen to live. What strikes me most about the human texture of life in the palace, reading between the lines of the lore, looking at what the setting implies without quite stating directly, is the role that scale plays in psychological formation. When the building you live and work in is large enough to contain its own weather systems, when the walls around you are so tall that you cannot see their tops, when the nearest person in authority over you is multiple levels of institutional hierarchy above you, there is a specific kind of psychological compression that happens to the individual sense of self. You become smaller, in your own reckoning, in relation to everything around you. This is not necessarily destructive. Sometimes it is genuinely liberating. The adept who has processed tithe records for 20 years and has long since stopped thinking of themselves as important in any individual sense, has, in some cases, found a deep peace in the anonymity of function. The work matters. Whether they personally matter is a question they have learned not to ask. For the pilgrims, the compression of self is the whole point of the journey. They came here specifically to feel small in relation to something worthy of smallness. The architecture of the palace, the deliberate scale, the vast proportions, and the way that even the corridors in the outer palace are sized for processions rather than individuals, is designed to produce this experience continuously. You cannot be fully comfortable in your own importance when the vaulted ceiling above you is 300 meters away and the pillar to your left is the diameter of a large building. The ego does not survive this environment intact unless it is very thoroughly armored, and the imperial faith, broadly speaking, is not in the business of armoring egos. This is partly why the custodians are so psychologically distinctive from everything else in the palace. They are the only permanent inhabitants who do not shrink. With their genetic modification and their centuries or millennia of experience have produced beings who exist in genuine relationship with the scale of the palace, rather than being overwhelmed by it. They know every corridor. They know every liem's layer of the security architecture. They know the political landscape and the military landscape and the psychic landscape of the most complex structure in the galaxy. And they carry all of that knowledge as working intelligence rather than as the crushing cognitive weight that it would represent for an ordinary human mind. They walk through the Hall of Heroes without being stopped by it, not because they are indifferent to it, but because they have processed its weight over centuries and found a way to carry it in motion. And then there is the strange category of beings who occupy the palace only briefly, but whose brief presence there is among the most significant experiences of their lives. The newly soul-bound astropaths, the rare visitors permitted beyond the eternity gate, the psychers brought for allocation who will never leave. These people encounter the palace in its most concentrated form, as the convergence of everything it is, the scale and the faith and the weight of history and the presence of the emperor, in a single experience that they will spend the rest of their lives processing. An astropath who lost their sight in the soul binding has exchanged their capacity to see the physical world for a permanent psychic connection to the most powerful mind in the galaxy. Whether they feel that trade as loss or as gift depends entirely on who they were before it happened and what they become after. The Imperial Palace is, in my estimation, one of the most genuinely unsettling concepts in all of Warhammer 40,000, and the setting does not lack for unsettling concepts. What makes it unsettling is not primarily the violence, though violence is built into every layer of its foundations and its daily function. It is not the scale, though the scale defeats comprehension. It is that it is almost comprehensible. You can trace the chain of decisions from the Unification Wars, through the Great Crusade, through the Horus Heresy, to the 41st Millennium, and understand, at each step, how the previous step made the next step necessary. The beauty gave way to the fortress because the fortress was necessary. You see, the fortress was expanded into a city because an empire of 1,000,000 worlds requires a city's worth of administration. The city became a hive because cities become hives when they stop having limits. And the hive forgot the beauty that started it because hives do not maintain what does not contribute to function. And at the end of this comprehensible chain of decisions, there is a building the size of a continent where billions of people live without natural light, where the most important object in human history is maintained by people who have admitted they do not know how to fix it, where 10,000 immortal warriors spend their endless lives standing watch over something that cannot speak, where 1,000 human beings are consumed every single day just to keep the infrastructure of galactic civilization functional, where people die in line for the opportunity to clean floors, and also where banners 10,000 years old hang in a hall that moves even Primarchs to tears, where a bell rings to mourn the greatest fallen, and the legend says the Emperor himself hears it and grieves, where billions of people across 1,000,000 worlds have directed their deepest faith and their most urgent prayers for 10 millennia, and where that faith has, in the law's own telling, contributed to something that genuinely exists in the warp and genuinely protects them. The Imperial Palace is everything the Imperium is. Its grandiosity, its genuine capacity for beauty and meaning, its bureaucratic indifference to the individual at scale, its profound, sincere, unironic faith, which is its willingness to consume lives in quantities that no moral framework built for individuals can adequately process, its sense of duty that outlasts everything, including the people who first felt it, its belief that the cost is worth the purpose, even when the cost is this high, And the purpose is this hard to hold on to. And somewhere at the center of all of it, a mind that was once a man's sights in the dark and thinks and hurts and keeps working. 10,000 years of keeping working, not because he has a choice, not because the machinery has left him a choice, but because the alternative to working is the end of everything he spent his life trying to build, and that is not acceptable to him. That has apparently never been acceptable to him, even through the long dark of everything that has happened. The Emperor protects. He must, or there is no one else. That is all for today's journey through the lore of the most extraordinary structure in the 41st millennium. If this kind of deep, unhurried exploration of the world of Warhammer 40,000 is something you value, please take a moment to like this video. It genuinely helps other people who would love this kind of content find their way here. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, I would be honored to have you join us. There is so much more of this universe left to explore together, and we will take our time with all of it. Until the next one, take good care of yourselves. The vigil continues.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.